That is Rent Collective on Rima. Hallelujah. Anyway, it is just coming up on 11:45. Andrew Urquhart with you on the program today. The situation in the Middle East, in particular, the ongoing war between Iran and the US and Israel. Now, there was some hopes that a ceasefire would lead to a peace deal. However, it seems it wasn't really a ceasefire. And as it's turned out, a peace deal. It was hoped that some deal could be sorted out in Islamabad, with Pakistan being a mediator in this space, but, neither of those have eventuated. Joining me on the program now, geopolitical expert from Otago, Dr. Geoffrey Miller. Kia ora, thanks for your time today.
Good morning, Andrew.
Firstly, to the ceasefire, it was proclaimed as being, hey, this is the beginning of the end. We're going to sort some things out here, but that never really eventuated.
Look, it was messy, to put it mildly, the ceasefire. We stumbled our way through the late last week to those talks in Islamabad, but
Yeah.
I do think it was very positive to see that those talks went ahead. There was a lot of debate about whether Iran would even show up to those talks
Yep.
in Islamabad, given that Israel was continuing its war with Lebanon against Hezbollah targets there.
Yep.
And Iran's view was that Lebanon was part of the ceasefire. In Iran's opinion, everything was connected, and it is all connected at
Yep.
the end of the day. And so therefore, Lebanon should be part of the ceasefire. And there were claims that that's what they were told, and that's not what actually happened. And then there were other small violations of the ceasefire as well. Iran fired into the Gulf states in the early hours of the ceasefire, supposedly after it had taken effect, for example. And yet we got to those talks in Islamabad. And as I say, I think that was actually a really positive outcome. But what came out of it perhaps wasn't as positive, obviously.
With JD Vance representing the United States in that regard, some would say an unusual choice given some of the other players that have been involved previously. And honestly, it didn't seem to be a strong effort. Less than 24 hours later, the deal was off. The negotiations came to an end. JD Vance back on a plane, heading home, saying that the Iranians weren't interested in doing a deal. Do we know any more of what went wrong, what failed in Islamabad?
It was really interesting. JD Vance, the US Vice President, came out with a very short press conference of about 5 minutes,
Yep.
Saying that Iran wouldn't accept the US's best offer, final offer, and that therefore the talks were off and he was going back to Washington. It all had an element of finality about it.
Yep.
And yet this week, the talks have actually seemed to have been put back on the agenda. So there will be another round of talks, it seems, on Thursday, well, today, our time, overnight, tonight. So, maybe this wasn't actually as final as it all sounded. And from what came out in the rumors afterwards was that Iran had put proposal to suspend its uranium enrichment for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
The US wanted 20 years. Now, that actually, it might sound like they're worlds apart on this,
Yep.
but actually it's a big concession on both sides. And that's actually what you want in a negotiation, is some element of compromise. Because before the talks, and even in the immediate aftermath of the talks, the rumor was that the US wasn't compromising, that there should be no uranium enrichment at all by Iran, absolutely none. The enriched uranium needed to be exported, and so on. And likewise, the rumor had been that Iran was insisting on its right to enrich uranium, but it actually seems like they actually put a compromise forward, and you can argue, well, perhaps there is a compromise there. Perhaps they'll end up agreeing on 10 years as a suspension of uranium enrichment. So in the end, perhaps they went from being very dogmatic to actually quite pragmatic, surprisingly so.
Hey, just wanting to focus on Lebanon. As we mentioned earlier, this is a bit of a sticking point. There was a ceasefire in one way, but Israel continuing to operate militarily with Lebanon against Hezbollah. How important is it that any ceasefire, any deal is, well, not just between the US and Iran, but also includes Israel and their operation into Lebanon at the moment?
Look, I think it's very important because everything is connected in the Middle East generally, and in particular in relation to this conflict. Uh, Hezbollah, remember, is an Iranian proxy group. That's
Yeah.
where it gets its main support from in terms of funding and weaponry. Ultimately, it does come from Tehran. I mean, it has a degree of independence. They're a long way from each other,
Hmm.
but it is true that Hezbollah has very, very, very strong connections with the regime in Iran. So it's important, I think, that there is peace everywhere, because I think if you don't solve the Lebanon piece of the puzzle,
Yeah.
things will continue to fester, and vice versa. If you don't solve the main issue, nothing can really be resolved between Israel and Lebanon. So I think it's important that we have a durable solution of peace on both fronts, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's the main theater, if you like,
Hmm.
between Iran and the United States. So everything ultimately is connected. And remember, this war, it's not just the United States
Yeah.
versus Iran, it's the United States and Israel
Mm.
versus Iran. So Israel is inextricably interlinked into this overall picture.
In terms of the big geopolitical picture and how that impacts us here in New Zealand and around the world, of course, the blockading of the Straits of Hormuz, this seems to have taken a backward step with, if you like, a double blockade of the Straits, both from Iran, but now also by the US Navy, attempting to cut off Iranian finances, but also, of course, Iranian allies such as China. This, well, has the potential of escalating quite quickly if US warships are stopping Chinese oil tankers.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I mean, this came out at the weekend that the United States was considering imposing its own blockade
Yep.
on the Strait of Hormuz. It all seemed quite absurd, and you thought, well, has Trump lost his mind on this one? How can you solve a blockade with another blockade? But actually, it is actually turned out to be quite clever, I think, from the United States, because the Strait of Hormuz is very important to Iran as well,
Yeah.
because that's where its own oil exports go out through, and two-thirds of its government revenues come from oil exports, and about 95% of Iran's oil exports come out from Kharg Island, that very small
Yep.
island in the northern Gulf, and they've got to get through the Strait of Hormuz. Uh, Also, Iran is the biggest grain importer in the Gulf region, so it needs grain to feed its people.
Mm.
It's a massive importer of grain. They can't get through with this US blockade, so it suddenly uses the leverage that Iran had with the Strait of Hormuz against it. And it has actually turned out to be quite, I think, quite savvy on the part of the United States, and it has actually worked. I mean, it was a risk, because the risk is that this could have led to the war restarting.
Yep.
And I'm not condoning escalation here. I think we need more de-escalation, not escalation. But I'm just saying, from the United States point of view, from Trump's point of view, this blockade has actually uh, given the United States some leverage
Yep.
again. I think it's equalized perhaps that bargaining chip. And from all accounts, from the reports we're getting, Iranian ships have been turned back by the United States, but they haven't been fired upon.
Hmm.
And I guess that was always a risk,
Yep.
that this could lead to more escalation and suddenly live clashes. Maybe Iran sends some drones and missiles towards these US ships that are doing the blockading, and that we're suddenly back to where we were, 10 days
Few
ago.
weeks
So
ago. Yeah. Yep.
yeah, it hasn't actually happened, and it's increased the pressure. And as you say, also the United States is applying financial pressure through the form of secondary sanctions
Hmm.
against banks and others in the likes of China, in the Gulf, even Oman and the UAE. If they trade with Iran, then they can be penalized by the United States potentially. So it is an interesting picture. There's a carrot and stick element
Yep.
here. I should also add, Andrew, the United States is sending in a lot more military capabilities into the Middle East this week. It's continued to do that, even though the ceasefire is in place,
Hmm.
even though the talks have been ongoing. There's been thousands of additional soldiers are being deployed, and a lot of additional military hardware is being sent in to the region. So you wonder, is this simply a backstop? If
Yep.
these negotiations fail, does Trump go back to war? Or is it even all of this just a tactic?
Yep.
Maybe the negotiations are not actually real. And I say that because we've been here before, back before the war on the 26th of February, the United States and Iran were negotiating in Switzerland, agreed to further negotiations, and then Donald Trump came over the top and attacked
Yep.
Iran. That happened also last June 2025, before the 12-day war. So look, the United States has form for doing that. So under the Trump administration, we hope
Certainly.
not. We
No,
hope that that's not the case.
and honestly, both sides now have something to lose. I think with this double blockade, as you say, this perhaps gives a more impetus to negotiations, particularly from an economic point of view. And Donald Trump now has certainly something to lose. I mean, you talked about tactics in the past, but the midterms just a few months away, and whether or not the US loses the war in Iran perhaps pales into insignificance in Trump's mind compared to losing the midterms. If the US is still at war at that part of the political calendar for the US, it may mean a lame duck presidency, and certainly that's something that Donald Trump would want to avoid.
Absolutely. Look, Donald Trump cares about winning. He doesn't like losing in any form. And that November month on the calendar just
Yep.
continues to loom larger. And when it comes to US politics, in the United States, everything is about the next election, and it's just a constant cycle. And we're now just over 6 months away from those midterm elections. So there is an incentive for Donald Trump to get this war wrapped up, to claim victory, to say with some level of conviction
Yep.
that the United States has come out better off than when it started. I mean, I think that's going to be a real struggle, because
Yeah.
I don't think we are better off. I wish this war hadn't have happened, and the United States and Iran should have and could have come to a deal back in late February in Switzerland. They actually had some good ideas on the table at that point, and it's a shame we've taken 6 weeks of destruction, 5,000 lives, huge amount of economic devastation across the region to get to this point. But yet it does feel that we are coming out of this war. I think that's the feeling I have at the moment, that neither side wants to go back to the battlefield. They want an end to the war. It's been incredibly destructive for all involved, and there is some appetite to have a negotiated solution. I don't think that appetite was actually there, let's say, a month ago.
Yep.
I think both sides wanted to just fight it out on the battlefield. I think now the things have shifted a little bit.
And now Donald Trump is notoriously fickle when it comes to deadlines. We've seen that over the years. However, when the war began, he saw this as taking about 5 weeks. We're certainly reaching that deadline now. Is this the sort of thing that there's the political will and diplomatic momentum to be able to wrap it up on that timeline, do you think?
Well, I think we're already past even the 4 to 5 week timeline. I mean, Donald Trump was talking about a few days, I think, privately at the outset of the war. And like all wars, they seem very simple on paper. And Donald Trump thought he could just go in, kill the top leadership, the Iranian regime would crumble, fold, there would be regime change, and he could celebrate himself as bringing about the fall of the theocratic regime in Tehran. It hasn't actually worked out like that. The regime is still very much in place. There's been a lot of destruction across the Gulf region, all those US military bases, the Gulf allies, very strong US allies have been hit very hard.
Yep.
The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, others in the region have been hit by all of this. So there's a huge incentive to wrap this up. And this war wasn't even popular to begin with, let alone now in the United States domestically. I think before the war, remember we had a conversation, Andrew, I believe, about those peace negotiations in Switzerland. I vaguely remember quoting a figure to you that there was only 27% of American voters were in favor of a war at that time, before the war even began. And that's usually when they're most popular. Once the casualty toll and the problems start to mount up, wars only become less popular. And this war wasn't even popular to begin with, even with Donald Trump's own base, really. 27% was a very low figure. So look, there are so many reasons to end this war and have some kind of negotiated settlement. And I think hopefully we're about to get there, and it could be sooner than we think. There are more talks, as I say, scheduled overnight that seem that will take place in Islamabad. Also, the reporting tells us it would be great to see some kind of solution worked out and worked out quickly.
Jeffrey, as always, appreciate your insight and your wisdom on this complicated issue. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the REMA studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.